What if one of the greatest TV shows of all time almost became a PlayStation VR experience, and we just never got to see it? Today we're diving into a fascinating report about Firesprite, a developer that has quietly been involved in some of PlayStation's biggest VR efforts, and how they were once working on a project based on Breaking Bad. Not only that, but the same studio also had a completely separate sci-fi horror game in development that never made it past the prototype stage. When you look at everything together, it paints a really interesting picture of how ambitious PlayStation's VR plans once were, and how many ideas never actually made it to release. To understand why this is such a big deal, you have to look at Firesprite itself. This isn't just some random studio. This is a team that has played a key role in pushing Sony's VR technology forward. They worked on titles like The Persistence and Horizon Call of the Mountain, which helped showcase what virtual reality could do on PlayStation hardware. Their focus has been on immersive atmospheric experiences, which actually makes them a perfect fit for something like Breaking Bad. But at the same time, the studio has had a rough few years, including layoffs in 2024 and multiple canceled projects such as a Twisted Metal Battle Royale that never saw the light of day. And as it turns out, those cancellations go even deeper than most people realized. According to this report, Firesprite was developing a Breaking Bad VR project sometime between 2017 and 2018 during the early days of PlayStation VR. Now, if you're imagining a full open world game where you build a drug empire, that's not quite what this was. Instead, the project was described as a narrative driven VR experience, something much closer to an interactive story than a traditional game. This actually lines up with how VR was being used at the time, where developers were experimenting with shorter, more cinematic content rather than large-scale gameplay systems. The idea here was immersion, putting you directly into the world of Breaking Bad in a way that no TV show or standard game ever could. And the details we do have make it sound like it could have been incredibly memorable. Players would have visited iconic locations from the series, like Walter White's backyard and the deserts of New Mexico, essentially stepping into the role of Walter himself. That kind of first-person perspective in VR could have created a very intense experience, especially given the grounded and often uncomfortable tone of Breaking Bad. It's not hard to imagine scenes where you're standing in the lab, mixing chemicals, or dealing with the consequences of decisions in a way that feels far more personal than just watching it on a screen. It wouldn't have been about action. It would have been about presence and tension. What makes this even more interesting is that this project wasn't completely unknown. Back in 2017, Vince Gilligan confirmed that he was working with PlayStation on a VR project, but at the time, nobody knew which studio was behind it. Now we know it was Firesprite. Unfortunately, the project didn't last long. It was reportedly canceled about a year after it was first mentioned, despite significant effort being put into it. Gilligan himself later talked about how difficult game development is, especially when you're trying to do something new with VR, and that really highlights the core issue here. Even with a massive IP like Breaking Bad, there are no guarantees in game development. When you look at the timing, the cancellation actually makes a lot of sense. VR in 2017 and 2018 were still in a very experimental phase. Developers were trying to figure out what worked, what didn't, and what players actually wanted from the technology. Creating a compelling VR experience based on a slow burn, character driven show like Breaking Bad would have been incredibly challenging. You're not just adapting a story, you're rethinking how that story is experienced. Add in the high cost of VR development and the risk of limited audience reach, and it becomes clear why Sony and Firesprite might have decided to pull the plug. But the Breaking Bad project wasn't the only ambitious idea that never made it. After that cancellation, Firesprite began working on a brand new sci-fi horror IP between 2018 and 2020. This project never even made it past the prototype stage, but based on the concept art that's been discovered, it had a very clear direction. It leaned heavily into dark futuristic horror with strong similarities to Dead Space. We're talking about intense body horror, unsettling environments, and a tone that was clearly meant to make players uncomfortable in the best way possible. It's the kind of game that could have fit perfectly within the modern horror landscape, especially with the resurgence of interest in sci-fi horror. Interestingly, some people initially thought this might have been connected to The Persistence, since both share a sci-fi horror setting, but the evidence suggests it was actually a completely new IP. That makes its cancellation even more disappointing because it represents a totally original idea that never got the chance to evolve into something bigger. And again, this is something that happens all the time in game development. For every game that releases, there are countless prototypes and concepts that never make it beyond early development. Despite all of these setbacks, Firesprite hasn't disappeared. In fact, they're still working on multiple projects right now. One of the most talked about is something codenamed Project Heartbreak, which first leaked in 2022. This is rumored to be connected to Until Dawn, one of PlayStation's most popular narrative-driven horror titles. The reports suggest that it could feature a female lead and possibly take place on an island, which already sounds like a strong setup for a cinematic horror experience. If this turns out to be true, it could end up being one of the studio's biggest releases yet. There's also another project known as Project Pillar, which was spotted in job listings. We don't know much about it yet, but it's reportedly being developed using Unreal Engine 5, which suggests that Firesprite is continuing to invest in cutting-edge technology. Between these projects, it's clear that the studio is still very much active and looking toward the future even after multiple cancellations. When you step back and look at everything, the story of Firesprite is actually a perfect example of how unpredictable game development can be. You can have a huge IP like Breaking Bad, a talented studio, and backing from a major company like PlayStation, and things can still fall apart. At the same time, those canceled ideas don't necessarily mean failure. They're often part of the process that leads to something better down the line. The lessons learned from those projects could very well shape whatever Firesprite releases next. And honestly, it's hard not to think about what could have been. A Breaking Bad VR experience might not have been a massive full-length game, but it could have been something really unique. Something that pushed storytelling in VR forward in a way we don't often see. The same goes for that sci-fi horror project. Both ideas had a lot of potential, and it's a shame we never got to experience them. If you enjoyed this video and found it interesting, make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss any future uploads. And if you want even more content, check out my Patreon, where the latest exclusive video dives into whether PCs and Xboxes are starting to become the same platform. Definitely a discussion you don't want to miss. Thanks for watching, and as always, game on.